Okay, hello there. My name is Professor Mark King. I'm from Loughborough University in the UK, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you to talk about my work in the badminton jump smash. I'm sorry I can't be there with you in Malaysia, but hopefully in the future I can come over again and to meet you all in person like I did last time. Anyway, so my passion is optimizing sport performance, and I'm going to use the example of the badminton jump smash today and to take you on a journey that we've been on for about the last 6 or 7 years, trying to understand this very dynamic and exciting performance and movement. So I'm a biomechanist at heart, and what is biomechanics in sport? Well, I use mathematics and mechanics to understand and explain movement in sport. So I love maths, I love sport, and I put those two together, and that's called biomechanics. And what I do is trying to look for things that are important. The human body is so complex that there's so much going on that you can be misled into thinking some things are important in sport when they're really just down to an individual and their preference. But I try and look through that and use a lens to say, what are the factors that are critical to performance, from both in sport from a performance perspective, but also injuries. And both are equally important, you could argue, in sport, but I'm going to focus in today on optimum performance. And so my philosophy as a biomechanist, and philosophy and maths don't always go together, but my philosophy would be in elite performance, elite performers, some factors are really critical. And if you don't do them, you're highly unlikely to perform well. But there's lots of other factors that are down to individual variation or coaching. So different coaches will coach their players in different ways. And probably all are equally valid, but it's those critical factors, not those individual ones, that I'm looking to identify in the first instance. So today we're going to be focusing on overhead throwing skills, of which badminton is clearly one example, but it's not the only one. And as our starting point, I just want us to reflect on a number of these throwing skills. So cricket fast bowling, so some of you may not be so familiar with, but I'll show you a video in a sec. Baseball pitching, the tennis serve, and the badminton smash, all of which you could argue are overhead throwing skills in one way, shape or form. And if we think about optimum performance for these, then we've got a combination of speed, accuracy, and angle or direction, all of which are important, but speed is arguably, the most exciting one, throwing something as fast as possible, hitting it as hard as possible. So let's think about these 4 examples, and what is the fastest we've seen from a human? Well, in cricket fast bowling, and here's a video clip of one of the best fast bowlers we've seen ever, and getting up to 160 kilometers an hour or 100 miles an hour is the limit that we see today in fast bowling. The interesting thing about fast bowling is you have to keep your bowling arm straight, but you do have a run-up, and there's different ways to generate speed. So if you can contrast that to baseball pitching, in baseball pitching, you don't have a run-up, you're stood on the mound, they're throwing the ball, but you can use your body fully and bend your arm. So you can actually get more speed here, even though you don't have a run-up. You can see him almost taking his head off. Well, let's give the person an implement now, and we'll add in a racket now. But look at tennis. Well, this is the fastest performer of a tennis serve. Interestingly, he's not one of the best players in the world, but the limit in tennis is around 260 kilometers an hour. But of course, the sport that we all love, badminton, is considerably faster than all of those due to the equipment design, if you like, the equipment, the person, and the shuttle being very light. And we can get consistently over 400 kilometers an hour. And here's Max Colding hitting the current record in competition of 426. So the interesting thing for me as a biomechanist is these sort of performances generate questions. And the first one is, if I look at that badminton data and I take some of the data from that same competition that where Matt's hit his record, is there are lots of other performers who I'm sure would love to be able to have the fastest smash in the world. Just like in tennis, where the world record holder isn't Nadal or Djokovic from a serve perspective. And so that starts at, well, why? Why can some people smash faster than others? What are the factors that limit performance? These are the questions that are really hard for a coach to answer, but really interesting to a biomechanist. So the questions. What is it that defines why some people can smash or bowl faster than others? Is it that they're just simply stronger? Or is it some aspects of their technique? And at the moment, that's probably unknown in many respects. But as a biomechanist, can I understand that? What is it about strength and technique or other things that allows some people to be better than others? And if we understood that, then could we identify what's someone's limit? So if you're coaching a player, can you decide or find out what their potential is? What's the maximum they could do? Because if you're coaching them, you can't coach them to be better than their limit. And so what does optimum look like? And what does optimum for one person look like compared to the next? You know, is there one way to smash the best, the fastest? Or is there lots of different ways? And then I'll finish and I'll reflect at the end on a young player and say, how can we coach people to reach their potential? That's the most interesting thing to me and probably the hardest. Even if we understand everything about elite performance, what's the best way to get someone from where they are to be that elite performer? And that's a real challenge, I think. So I'm going to take you on this journey of data collection. And it starts at low-tech levels and finishes at high, you could argue. So this goes back maybe 6 or 7 years now, if not slightly more, where we managed to instrument my dining hall at Loughborough University. I'm quite fortunate. I have rather a large dining hall because I'm a warden of a hall of residence, and we can fit a badminton court in it, only just. So this doesn't really look like a complete badminton environment, but it is. There's a badminton court there you can see, and you'll see later some of the tech we use. It's hard to see here, but there are lots of cameras in the background. And then if you look at the image with the person, a friend that I know well, really happily marked up with lots of sticky reflective markers all over him. And we can track those markers really accurately. And then we also put some tape on the racket so we can see the racket as well as the shuttle. So you see in the bottom right, there's a bit of reflective tape on the shuttle. So the system tracks all of these markers. And we capture data at high frequency, and we ask the person to smash as fast as possible. So you can see those cameras in the background, and we're going to ask, so you see up here, you'll see the cameras are here. Hopefully you can see my mouse on the screen, and then the person's going to smash. So the shuttle's served up, and we just ask the person to smash. Do the best they can. Smash as fast as possible. So as you're watching these videos as we go through, how would you improve that person's technique? Is it as good as it could be? These are tough questions to answer. So from a biomechanical perspective, from that recording, what we see is the markers. So you can see that I put this in a computer environment so we can see the badminton court in the background. But what the system sees is the markers, doesn't see the person. But you can already see the racket and the person's technique. And the next part of the process is to identify where each of those markers is, which one is which. We can do that, and we then essentially do dot the dot. My students do this, and they often need a pair of glasses by the end of it. But we go from those dots to a labelled environment. We can see that's now starting to look. We can tell there's a person there smashing. And then it's not too difficult to then drop a skeleton on or anything else to make it more visually appealing. Well, once we've done that, the next part typically in the process to say, there's a lot of data there. Could we start to pick out some key instances that are important? So there's the start, just in a slightly different view. Well, often you say, well, where do you start? What's the first part that's of interest? Well, quite often, and you're looking for something that's objective, that you can well define in every single trial that you would look at. So in here, we'd look at, the lowest point of the knees, because the most flexed point of the knees is one critical instant. And then we could say, okay, when the racket is being prepared and it's at the lowest point behind the back, that's another critical instant we could identify. And then obviously contact with the shuttle. There's lots of different ways we can look at it, but essentially we're looking for important features, important time points within the movement. So from there, that was the first data collection. And then we had the opportunity with Badminton World Federation and their support to take that project to a new level. And I'm going to show all the results from all the projects at the end rather than at the end of each project. And we were quite fortunate to firstly go to the All England Championships back in 2016, seems like a lifetime ago now. And then Badminton England allowed us access to all of their players back in December 2016. And then we actually went to the World Championships up in Glasgow and set up an instrumented court. So I'll show you some pictures just of interest from all of those. So here's one of the best players in the world now. Back then, got involved in this data collection, and you can see all the cameras around the top. We've got an experienced coach feeding the shuttle, and the person smashing towards that target in the middle. And that's quite an typical environment, if you like, in badminton, where we put a target like tubes down for the player to try and hit, while also, of course, smashing as fast as possible. Now, if you were this person's coach, would you suggest anything to improve their smash technique? So he's homing in on those tubes, and I think he might just hit them at the end if we're lucky. Okay. So from there, we put that into that computer environment that you're now familiar with, labeled up those markers, record it, and then we've got the smash. So that one there was pretty good, in a training environment up at 360 kilometers an hour. So now we go to Badminton England, where we got access. We've changed our feeder now to be a robot, to be a feeding machine, to got more consistency and control. You can see the cameras, it's the same system moved. This is to the home of badminton in Milton Keynes at Badminton England. And there we got access to a number of the players, the very best in England. This video is quite nice because it shows the tribulations of being a PhD student. So one of my PhD students there is looking after the tubes, and while Marcus manages to knock them all down. The only person who's ever done that for us, and then the student is trying desperately to put them back up without being hit. And I think Marcus, his accuracy goes towards the end as he's trying to hit the PhD student. But no one was injured during this data collection. And then one last one of the other top performers in England. So we have some really good data from across these data sets. And then we were fortunate, lastly, to go to Glasgow and to the World Championships. So we set up again the same system. As you can see, you should be very familiar with that now. So we've got these cameras all around the person, markers on the player. We've got some really nice, very slow motion data here, as well as everything else. Shuttle comes up, person flexes, we have that critical starting point, maximum knee flexion. From there, they jump up, racket goes back, and smash. Get that information. So we're all familiar with information, But what do we find? What's interesting? What have we learned on this journey? Well, the first thing to say is that badminton is really challenging. So if you think the shuttle is going from not really moving to around 400 kilometers an hour in 1 millisecond, and that's a really challenging situation to try and track accurately. So the starting point was there's lots of equations. Well beyond my knowledge, some of my students worked out all these equations to say we can accurately know where the shuttle hits on the racket, and nobody else had even done that at the start of this project. So what we were able to do to start off with was to say we can accurately work out where the shuttle hits on the racket, what the speed of the smash is as it comes off the racket, and there's lots of challenges with the shuttle because it slows down so quickly. What's the angle of the smash, how steeply, and also the direction. So some published work from, well, earlier this year. One of the first real paper to come out from that work was to say, okay, well, where do people make contact on the racket? So we took all of the data across those data collections I've just showed you and took the fastest smash for each person. That's where it would be. And that broadly looks to be in the middle. But if we add a bit more data to that, so take the top 5% from every player, you can start to see that, well, maybe it's not quite in the middle. And then the top 10% from everybody. In fact, what we find is that, and this is quite interesting, is that the optimum location isn't quite in the middle of the racket, which seems strange to me. But then if you think about how you hit a smash and you think back to those videos we've seen, the arm is pronating, and you can't really see. I'll try and put my hand here, but you'll see here that as they hit, if my hand is the racket is moving like that. So the forearm's moving like this. So my thumb side is moving quicker than my little finger side. So as the hand comes through, if this is the racket, it hits like that. So this side is moving quicker than that side. And if you then, now on the screen it's looking from the reverse point of view, so on the screen the right-hand side of the racket is the side where my thumb would be. And so that side of the racket is moving through the air slightly faster than the other. So people get their fastest smashes from just off center. And so we see that heat map of where maximum speed comes from. And it's quite clear as we display it like that, that it's slightly above center. You get more racket head speed the higher up the racket you go, and slightly to the right, but only a little bit. But people naturally work that out for themselves. And then in terms of direction, you know, the shuttles that go off in the right direction towards the target, if you like, come from just, again, off center. That's slightly off center. And again, that's a combination of the racket moving forwards and twisting that causes that to happen. We visualize that on the court, and we look at 1, 2, and 3 standard deviations in terms of impact location on the racket. You can see the spread that results on in terms of where the shuttle will land. So if you've got a player that always goes for the lines, then of course they'll miss just as frequently as they'll keep the shuttle in. But that accuracy, and obviously different players, some with a smaller spread of impact locations on the racket will have a smaller spread in terms of where the shuttle goes. But we're now able to understand what that really looks like. And if you want to read the detail behind that, then the paper at the bottom is there. But what about speed? Where does that speed come from? So I'm going to show a little video first, and the skeleton's going to be colored. As it gets faster, it's going to change color. So just let's play this through first, and hopefully I can drag this across the screen for you. So this is the start of the smash. Not much happens. You can see things perhaps is happening, but here's the interesting bit starting. So the trunk is brought forward first. See that quite clearly, and then it's hard to see because the arm isn't very big or thick, but the redness is going down the arm into the racket. So that speed starts in the trunk and builds up and goes down the arm. Well, I've picked out those key images, and you can quite clearly see that build-up of speed, starting at the core, going into the arm, and then down to the racket. So I think it's really important to emphasize the importance of the trunk. There's two things I want to think about for the trunk. We've got this X factor. This is the long axis twist. So twisting of the rib cage, if you like, the shoulders backwards and forwards, and then the trunk being brought forwards, that flexion forwards. People who smash faster have more of that typically. So some specifics then. Well, if you looked at any of the literature on overhead throwing skills, probably the thing that would come out strongest would be shoulder internal rotation. And indeed, this is clearly important in smashing. So faster smashes have greater amounts of internal rotation at contact. So here in these graphs, on the left at the bottom, what I've got here is shoulder internal external rotation. And the thick line here, if you can see my mouse, is the average of all the data in this study. And then this shaded out area is sort of the range of the data. And you can see what happens. 0 is at prep and 100% is at contact. And you've got the shoulder externally rotating all the way through to here, and then very rapidly internally rotating up to contact. And then on the right hand, just to emphasize the differences, we've picked the fastest and slowest players in this study. And if we just focus on the end point, the bit that's interesting here is the slower player starts to internally try and rotate their shoulder from this minimum point earlier. And this graph is, the gradient here is much shallower. As the faster smasher starts later, starts almost at 90% of the movement time, and rapidly internally rotates and goes way, way beyond the other player, all the way up to here, before contact. And this allows so much more work to be done by the shoulder to generate more speed. So this angle that the shoulder internally can rotate through is critical to smashing. The next one I want to, and I mentioned it on the graphics before, was that twist, the X factor. So here on the right, we've got, again, the average and the ranges. You can see that basically there's a counter rotation of the shoulders and then a rapid return. But again, the fastest and the slowest smash, you can see again this trend for it to start later, although it's a bit wobbly, these graphs, and to twist back. Whereas the person who doesn't smash as fast doesn't counter-rotate as far through to impact. And the interesting thing with all of these, and it's important to say, is not always more is better. So if this person had counter-rotated down here, that doesn't mean they would have smashed faster. For every player, there's an optimum. And that's something that I'll come back to in the conclusions. But with all of these relationships, they're linear relationships, but it doesn't mean that more is always better. And it's quite challenging for an individual to work out where the best is. And then in this last one, we just now look at the effect of those movements of the person on the racket. So here we've got racket head speed, and racket head speed is fundamental to producing shuttle speed. Then you can see very little racket head speed for most of the time, and then a rapid build-up at the end. But if we emphasize the difference between the slowest and the fastest players, we can see for the slower players, we have a much slower build-up that starts earlier. Remember, like with the shoulder internal rotation. So they start much earlier proportionally, and this gradient here is much shallower. Whereas the faster player starts really late and has a really rapid increase up to impact. And you can see the difference in racket head speed at the end. Now, this is a world-class player. This player down here is not going to be world-class. So what are those contributions to speed of contact in more broader terms? Well, I've emphasized that shoulder internal rotation is key. We estimate that that's about 40% of the contribution to speed at contact. The wrist is also important, and I didn't put a graph up. The wrist data tends to be a bit more noisy from over lots of players, and there's a link between how the wrist is used and the grip on the racket. But in general terms, the wrist does make a substantial contribution, but not as much as the shoulder. And then the other one is the bringing forward of the arm, the horizontal flexion, as we've called it. So this is, if you like, movement of the upper arm from behind the body to in front. That horizontal movement forwards contributes. And interestingly, what happens at the elbow seems to not have a substantial effect or contribution to speed. And we think this is more because the elbow is used to position the arm in the right place, firstly to make contact, but also to then make maximum use of the shoulder internal rotation. So if you think of the elbow, and in previous work we sort of were suggesting that an elbow angle around of 90 degrees earlier in the movement allowed you to get the most out of the shoulder internal rotation. So it's not that the extension at the elbow is producing speed. It's actually keeping the elbow a bit bent to then allow the effect of shoulder internal rotation to produce the speed in the smash. And the last thing to mention is the racket does make a contribution. You can't turn someone from being an average player to having the fastest smash in the world just by giving them the right racket, but it does make a contribution that's not insignificant. So we estimate it, it's around 6%. So I've said lots here in this presentation. I'm going to ask you all a question now and see if you pass the test as a finishing point almost in the presentation. This is some data from working with Yuvraj and the colleagues over in Malaysia on some of their best players, and was part of Yuvraj's MSc project. And this is, I've got two graphical sequences here. Top one, A, is the fastest person in the study, and the bottom one is the slowest person, still with really good technique. Who smashes faster? And I think I've just told you the answer, which I didn't mean to, but it's A. But can you pick out the technique things that this person does? And what I would focus your attention on is this picture here. Lots of people look at different things in this. Some people look at this position. But to me as a biomechanist, not as a coach, even though I do play badminton myself, is that it's from this position to that position that's really interesting for me, because this is where the speed comes. Everything else is preparation. But this position here, you can see that the racket's already started to come forwards a little bit, perhaps. Certainly not as extreme. Whereas this person, their racket is in a much more, extreme position here, and it's got a bigger range of motion to go from here through to there. And that, to me, and we see this in other sports as well, this range of movement is important, and it's how we can generate speed. But there's still more to be understood on this. So, as a summary to this presentation, why can some players smash much faster than others? Is it strength or technique? Well, I've not really addressed strength in this presentation, but given the relationships we find where we ignore the contribution of strength, and we can see how important technique is, I think we can comfortably argue that technique is critical. And in other sports, we've shown that strength makes little difference, whereas technique does. And then secondly, I think we're starting to understand what optimum looks like. I don't think we necessarily can understand, certainly in badminton, what the limit is for an individual, but there's other techniques which we hope to use in the future that will get there. But we certainly are having a really good understanding now of what optimum looks like. And then the last point, I'm going to play you a little video of my son, but around how to coach young players to bowl or smash faster. Well, that I think needs more work and more research. How can you take a 14-year-old who's got a certain level of performance and progress them to optimum? I've got a very experienced badminton coach starting a PhD with me soon, and we're going to start to look at that and see what's the best way to coach people to produce their best. So this was a few years ago in that first data collection. I need to update this video with where he is now. He's almost an adult now and performing very nicely in badminton. But a young, keen, enthusiastic player, how can we coach these players to reach their potential, whatever that is? That's the real challenge for us, and that's where I hope we can all get to, using science and technology. Of course, this sort of work isn't possible without the help of lots of others, and I acknowledge everybody's contributions, as well as the support of national governing bodies and world federations as well. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you found it interesting. I'd like to thank you, and this was my best moment in badminton, arguably to date, where I managed to get a bronze at the World Senior Championships behind some pretty good players. Anyway, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.